In this video, we're going to set ourselves up a lose collider so that when the ball passes through the lose collider, the player loses, and we're going to talk about collisions, triggers, and collision events. Just a quick point to start off with. In my previous video, I'd mentioned that we needed to stop our ball rotating because I've got my light set up in a way where the ball's not really supposed to rotate. It looks a little bit silly if it's rotating around like that. We can do that very easily because the ball has a rigid body 2D, and if you expand rigid body 2D, you'll see a constraints area. Click on constraints, open it up, and there's freeze rotation. Freeze means don't let it happen. So if we freeze rotation, Z is the only axis that we have as an option because that's the only axis that things rotate on in 2D. It's clockwise or anti-clockwise. If we freeze rotation, then when the ball bounces off something funky, it's not going to go swinging through the air like that. It's just going to stay straight up and down. You might have a ball with better texture on it where you do want it to spin around and look interesting, in which case you wouldn't freeze the rotation. Okay, now what we're going to talk about is collisions, colliders, and triggers. And we've already been looking at colliders. We can see around our paddle we have a collider, around our block in here we have a collider, and around our ball we have a collider. Now we're going to talk about what happens when colliders touch colliders. First thing I will do is add a lose collider. And that is basically saying when the ball, let me get my thingy here, when the ball misses the paddle and goes down here, we need it to hit something that says the player has lost. If it just goes, keeps going forever, then the engine doesn't know what to do. It's like, I'm hanging out here. The ball seems to be not in the play space, so we need to tell it. When it gets to this particular point, we need to have lost. So to do that, we're going to right-click, create empty game object, and we'll call this lose collider. Lose collider. Okay. We'll reset the transform. That's good practice. You can see at the moment it's in the middle of our screen. If we go right-click on transform and reset, puts it back to the 0, 0. So it's nice and neat and tidy. Now we will, for our lose collider, add a component, which is collider 2D, box collider 2D. Box collider 2D. I'll move it down below. So there's a little bit of space underneath the game world. And click on edit collider. Drag this across so it's filling up the entirety of the area below my world. So when the ball comes flying down in here, it's going to connect with this collider, and then we can send a message to say something happened. Now, there's two main paradigms when it comes to colliders and sending messages. One is that this object just here is will send a collision event, and the other is that this object just here will send a trigger event. Now, what's the difference between collision and trigger? Well, the main difference is this is trigger checkbox that we have here. Oh, not that one there. So is trigger. Now, by default, is trigger is not turned on, which means a collision will take place. If I click play here, the ball has a collider. We have our lose collider. When the ball drops, it goes bounce because a collision event's taken place. If I was to change the box collider here and say it's actually a trigger volume, this turns it into a trigger volume. That means the ball is going to pass through. If something's a trigger, it's basically saying I'm going to watch when things pass through me, but I'm not going to prevent them from passing through. If we click play now, the ball will just go straight through our trigger volume. Okay, this is a super handy technique in game development because this might be a player running through an area and running over an invisible lever that opens a door, or it could be the player running through an area that triggers a cinematic sequence to play, or it could be a million other things where you just basically need to say, when something passes through this space, I want something else to happen. Now, it's important that you know what event is taking place, and Unity has given us some information about that. And I've given you the link against this lecture to do with collider interactions, and there's two matrices. They have the same information top and to the side, but it's broken into two. I'm going to show you a slide in a moment where we've joined these two slides together, but essentially there are three different aspects. There's the static collider, the rigid body collider, and the kinematic rigid collider. And if you jump into Unity, click on the ball, you'll see against our rigid body 2D, we have three types of body type. We have we have dynamic, kinematic, and static. Static means that it doesn't move at all. Kinematic means that we push it around to particular spots, go here, go there, which is what we're going to do with the paddle. And dynamic means, well, just bounce around as per what the physics engine thinks it should. When you look at the Unity docs, it's a little bit incomplete because it refers to kind of regular rigid body or normal rigid body. What it's referring to there is dynamic rigid body. Okay, so we have static, dynamic, kinematic, static, dynamic, kinematic, and in yellow we're looking at collision, and in green we're looking at trigger. The difference between the two is that these green ones is a situation where, back over into Unity, is where we have taken something and clicked is trigger and made it a trigger volume. So you can look and say, okay, well, let's use our use case here. At the moment we have the Lose Collider and we have the ball. What is the ball? Let's click on the ball. The ball has a rigid body, yes, and it's a dynamic rigid body. It does not have, let's look at its collider, does not have trigger on. So that makes it a dynamic rigid body collision or collider. It's going to cause a collision, not a trigger event. So we say dynamic rigid body collider. Yep, that's correct. That means we're looking at all of these rows here, and basically anything else it comes into contact with, it will cause an event. Which event will it be? Well, if it connects with something that is not a trigger, i.e. it's just a collider, it will cause a collision event. And if it connects with something or passes through something that's a trigger, it will cause a trigger event. Why does that matter? Well, in our code, we need to write it slightly differently if it's a collision event than if it is a trigger event. If you try to call a trigger event when you've got two colliders causing a collision, then it won't know what's going on. So let's go ahead and create something then to use that information. Let's turn all of this theory into something practical. If you click on Lose Collider, we need to create ourselves a new script. We'll call this Lose Collider. Capital L, capital C, no spaces. Create that as a new script. And because we've created it here, that has been added straight away to the Lose Collider. It's also going to exist in our assets folder. So it puts it down here in assets and it's attached it as a component to the Lose Collider. I'm going to tidy it up a bit and just drag Lose Collider into my scripts. So it's tidied in my assets folder. Click back on Lose Collider and open up Lose Collider in Visual Studio. Double click on it. What I'm going to do first of all is remove the start and update methods. We're not going to use those. We're going to need those. And we will create ourselves an on-trigger event. And the way we do that is we start by typing private. It's a good habit to write private or public so that we know that this is only accessible to this particular class, this particular script. Private void, there's no return type, it's just void. And if you start typing on trigger, well, not on trigger, that's an animal. On trigger, enter 2D, make sure it's 2D, and then auto-complete that with enter or tab. It will fill out a whole bunch of extra information here. It will put that we're passing in collider 2D and collision. So it's of type collider 2D and it's collision. And it will give us the structure for an on-trigger enter 2D event. Now, what do we want to have happen? This is basically saying when a trigger event happens, in relation to the Lose Collider, which is another way of saying when something passes through the Lose Collider, what do we want to have happen? Well, in this instance, let's have a look at Unity here. What we want to have happen is that we load the game over scene. We've got a scene here which is game over, and we load that so it will take the player to that. And this is where I'm going to give you a challenge because we've done a little bit of the loading, so it's a good chance for you to flex your muscles here. I want you to load a level using a string reference. We haven't done this before, and this is a different way of loading a level. It comes with its pros and its cons, which we'll talk about after you've done this challenge. So when the ball enters our Lose Collider trigger volume, load the game over scene. And what you'll need to do is use the scene management namespace. Remember to do that. We've done this previously, so you'll need to do that at the top of your script. Use the scene management namespace. And to pass in a string reference for the scene we want to load. So have a look at what we've done previously. Jump into the Unity docs for scene management and loading scenes. It'll be just one statement you need to type. And when we're figuring out what it is that we want to load, we are loading the game over scene. Okay, so it's a little bit trickier because I'm not giving you the exact syntax to type in. But jump in, give that a go. And when you're done, I'll see you back here in a moment. Okay, so first of all, using Unity Engine .scene management, That will allow us to use all of the methods and the information that is available within the scene management namespace. So I'm going to start with scene manager dot. What are our options here? We've got load scene. We're sitting right over the top of it, load scene. And then what we want to do is to pass in, let me just have a look over here at what it's called. It's called game over. So type in game over and semicolon. Save that. We'll check that it works. Then I want to take you through a point or two. Click on play. Sometimes it takes a moment to compile our script. Might need to click play. Yep, there we go. Click play again. Oh, am I going to hit that paddle? Hopefully not. No, okay. And you see it went click, and the very moment it came into contact, we loaded our game over scene. We can click play, start, do that again, blonk, it goes into the same process again. So we're successfully having the player lose when it goes past their paddle by hitting this lose collider. Now I want to point something out in our script we've done here. You want to avoid using string references as much as possible, because what's going to happen here, we've got this baked right into our code. In the future, if we get there and say, you know what I want to do, if the ball goes down here and the player dies or loses the game, I want them to go to some sort of, I don't know, pay to continue level, for example. And they're like, great, that's going to be amazing. And then we click play, and our ball passes through the collider, vroom, nothing happens. And then we sit there saying, why on earth didn't that happen? And we need to remember that, well, we've actually hard-coded that it is game over, and we don't have this other scene in here. We don't have a pay to continue. And you can see we're getting an error, a red error saying game over couldn't be loaded because there isn't one. So that's why we try to avoid using string references, but I want to use it in this instance. So first of all, you know how it works and you're using it. It's very useful if you've got a small project, you know what's going on, you're on top of it, and you're pretty certain that we're never going to change the name of game over. Then we can put it in confidence. We can put it in with confidence. We can say game over, yep, it's always going to be called game over. In this case, we're using it because it works pretty well for what we want to do for this stage of the course. Okay, great work. So we've made a lose condition for our game. Excellent. I will see you in the next lecture.